Good afternoon, and thank you for joining me. As Amir said, I'm Philip Lambert, and I'm pleased to talk to you today about my research into the topic of creativity and how I've found that it's synonymous with life. And I might have a few pauses along the way here because I wasn't prepared for working with Collaborate. I'm using PowerPoint on one screen and Collaborate on the other, so I'm advancing between two different applications. When I started my journey studying creativity, I started with a wide-ranging literature review covering primarily the definition of creativity, the assessment of creativity, and approaches to enhancing creativity. What I found is that creativity is a complex topic that's poorly understood. It suffers from a multitude of definitions, and assessment criteria is an ongoing problem. When looking into whether creativity can be taught, the results were generally positive, but a majority of the studies that I came across were by researchers who were supporting their own approach to enhancing creativity. More importantly, I found that creativity suffers from a lack of an overarching theory. Over the years, theories of creativity have evolved from simple personality-based theories to social psychology theories, and then moving on to componential theories, which in a sense simply means creativity is multifaceted, and then moving on to systems theories of creativity, which in very simple terms means multifaceted and that each facet interacts with and affects the others. I believe the next step in this evolution, what I've been working on, is theories of creativity based on complex adaptive systems theory. Using complexity theory to better understand creativity can help us be better creative problem solvers and help us teach creative subjects more effectively. Perhaps more surprisingly, it can help us better understand life. And today I will briefly discuss the parallels between complexity theory and creativity, while proposing that creativity is fundamental to all life and that this understanding can help us live a more creative life. My work involves the integration of two very large topics that can be challenging to understand on their own. So I will necessarily use some significant simplifications, and I'll breeze through some fairly deep topics quickly. However, I hope to leave us some time at the end for questions and discussion. This is a high-level representation, I think it's still coming up here, of a complex adaptive systems and the creative, that shows how the complex adaptive systems and creative process are interrelated. I won't dig into this at this point, but I'll be using this model as a graphic organizer throughout my presentation today. In order to discuss the relationship between creativity and complex adaptive systems, you will of course have to have some understanding of just what complex adaptive systems are. A complex adaptive system is any set of diverse, independent yet interdependent agents that interact with and adapt to each other and their environment, thereby resulting in a new emergent entity that could not have been predicted even with complete knowledge of the agents and their relationships. And I'll get into definitions of many of those other words in a moment, but first some examples might help. Examples include the human brain, living organisms, societies, economies, immune systems, colonies of social insects. So what do all of these systems have in common? Each of these examples consist of a number of agents that are diverse, interconnected, independent yet interdependent, and they are adaptive, just as stated in the definition for complex adaptive systems. It's a lot to take in all at once, and each of those words used to define complex adaptive systems probably needs its own definition. So let's start with agents. An agent is an entity that interacts with other agents in its environment and adapts its behavior based on those interactions. And what's meant by diverse? Individual agents differ from each other in many ways. For example, individual humans are agents that make up the complex adaptive system known as a society. And we measure our differences along many dimensions. For instance, what's known as the Big Five personality traits is intended to show how diverse we are along the dimensions of openness, conscientiousness, agreeableness, extroversion, and neuroticism. As individual human beings, we're each free to make independent choices regarding our own actions and reactions. However, our choice will have an effect, however large or small, on society as a whole and on other agents. Our actions will have an effect on other agents we're in direct contact with, and through them may have an effect on other agents they are in contact with, and so on. All other agents will also be affected by any changes in the overall society resulting from our actions. In this way, all agents are interconnected and interdependent, yet independent. This independence and interdependence results in a continuous adaptive behavior. My choices have an effect on those around me and the overall society. In response to this, other agents adapt, making choices based on this new environment, which further changes the environment, further influencing my choices, that is, further influencing my adaptive behavior and the choices of others. All of this constant interaction and adapting results in three main characteristics that are seen in all complex adaptive systems. The order-chaos dynamic, self-organization, and emergence and creativity. Each of these characteristics will be discussed here, starting with the order-chaos dynamic. Just waiting for that slide to come up. All life exists between the extremes of complete order and complete chaos, with dynamic forces pulling it in opposite directions, resulting in a dynamic balance. That is, an equilibrium is never achieved because of all the changing aspects of the agent's environment. This dynamic balance is called the order-chaos dynamic, which is one of the signatures of complex adaptive systems. Many characteristics of any complex adaptive system can be expected to be continuums along which the system will move as agents adapt to each other and the system adapts to its environment. Humans are complex adaptive systems, and we're made up of other complex adaptive systems, from individual cells to our brains, and we're surrounded by other complex adaptive systems, from the bacteria in and on our bodies that outnumber ourselves by 10 to 1, to all living things, to societies and ecosystems. So we're always in a state of adaptation. We're always far from equilibrium. The result is of all of this constant adaptation and readaptation is that we live in a dynamic balance between the extremes of complete order and complete chaos. These adaptive forces in this dynamic balance prevent us from ever reaching extremes or from reaching a point of stasis. And that's a very good thing, because no living things exist in a state of complete order, complete chaos, or in a state of stasis. But the question arises, how does this characteristic of complex adaptive systems relate to creativity? For many years, creativity researchers have noted a lot of contradictions in their research results. More recently, some of these researchers have referred to these contradictions as creativity paradoxes. Creative people, it seems, tend to find a middle way, not by operating at a midpoint along a continuum, but by operating at and blending two or more extreme positions. This is consistent with complexity theory, particularly the order-chaos dynamic characteristic that we just discussed. The number of paradoxes discovered in creativity research provides evidence for creativity being an emergent characteristic of complex adaptive systems. And complexity theory, the order-chaos dynamic in particular, provides a theoretical framework where creativity research results can be seen as expected rather than contradictory or paradoxical. Research has shown, for example, that more creative people tend to move more over time on the extroversion continuum. And there's also evidence that more creative people seem to be able to make use of their knowledge, intelligence, and expertise when it's most beneficial. For example, when convergent thinking is required for effective problem solving. However, these highly creative people are also able to ignore their knowledge when that's more beneficial, such as when divergent thinking is required for effective creative problem solving. It's been theorized that the highly creative person may move from a near psychotic state involving over-inclusiveness, where most ideas are allowed to reach conscious consideration when generating new ideas, to the single-mindedness of dogmatism, when perseverance is required to see ideas through to implementation and widespread use. There's some research that suggests that highly creative individuals benefit from the balancing effect of ego strength and lower stress, thereby turning over-inclusiveness into a net benefit rather than it becoming pathological. Similarly, highly creative people are adept at allowing their minds to wander, engaging what's known as the brain's default network when divergent thinking is required, while also being able to employ the brain's executive attention network to be highly focused when convergent thinking is called for. In a similar vein, Stacy has argued that creative organizations require the right balance along 5 continuums, that there's an optimum point along each of these where maximum creative potential is reached. Applying the order-chaos dynamic theory to Stacy's work suggests that the optimum point along these continuums is constantly moving. This makes intuitive sense since we know that organizations are faced with a constantly changing competitive landscape. The highly creative organization then is the organization that can and does move dynamically along these continuums as situations change. That is, highly creative organizations, like highly creative people, are those that are the most adaptable to change. The second characteristic of complex adaptive systems that I'll discuss is self-organization. I will also discuss its relationship to the diffusion of innovations. The diffusion of new ideas is something that some creativity research theorists argue is a requirement in order for something to be considered creative. However, I'll delve into the definition of creativity in a little more detail when we discuss emergence and creativity. Now, this next slide is going to be a little harder for me to present because in PowerPoint I had this building step by step, and here it's just a PDF of all the components at once, but we'll work through this. As stated earlier, a complex adaptive system is one in which diverse, interconnected, independent elements adapt their behavior based on interactions with other agents and their environment. The SmallWorld network topology is just one possible arrangement of these interconnected agents. However, it turns out to be a common one in complex adaptive systems, including networks as diverse as the human brain, social networks, the internet, and food webs. The SmallWorld network arrangement is one way in which complex adaptive systems self-organize, and it seems to be a very powerful way of organizing. Researchers Watts and Strogatz defined the term SmallWorld networks to refer to networks with high local clustering and global path lengths, and I'll get into how you define that in just a moment. That is, when the clustering coefficient is high and the average of the shortest paths between two nodes is low. I'll use this very small world network to work through as an example. Consider the cluster highlighted with the red box. There are 7 agents in this cluster, and the total number of possible connections between them is 21, but the actual number of connections between them is 10. This results in a clustering coefficient of 10 divided by 21. And this is as complicated as the math will get in this presentation. That comes to approximately 0.476. And if this calculation is repeated for the other 3 clusters in the example network, and the average of the 4 clusters calculated, then the result is the clustering coefficient. For global path lengths, if we look at the 2 agents highlighted by the red arrows and count the smallest number of connections that will connect the 2, we can see that it's 5 in this case. If we repeat that calculation for all pairs of agents in this network and take the average, then we've calculated the global path length. Once again, when the clustering coefficient is high and the global path length is low, the network is a small world network. And it turns out that small world networks have some pretty impressive properties, as we'll soon see. Again, this next slide was one that was supposed to build in steps. So you're going to miss a little bit. This when it comes up, what you'll see is a diagram that illustrates scientific and research collaboration network in and around the Atlanta area. But it seems to be taking its time. There it is. Hopefully you see that now. And the next one shows that, well, there's a lot of research going on into how to best visualize these networks. And the next slide is a visualization based on a new tool called Group in a Box. It's a little slow coming up there. There we go. The diffusion of innovation is a social process which depends, at least in part, on the communication channels of the social system. Human social systems are now recognized and studied as small world networks, a concept which has been popularized as the 6 degrees of separation concept, and the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, which you may have heard of. Stanley Milgram was the first to gather experimental evidence to support the small world concept. Milgram asked 294 individuals in Boston and Nebraska to try to get a message to a target person using only a chain of friends and acquaintances. The target person was chosen at random, lived in the United States, and was the same for all individuals who participated. Milgram's first study of this type resulted in a median path length of 5 and a mode of 6, giving rise to the term 6 degrees of separation. The next major advance in the study of small world networks came when Watson-Strogatz illustrated graphically and mathematically how small world network topology works. And this slide is taken from their paper. They noted how up until then, network research was originally carried out under the assumption of either complete regularity or complete randomness in network typology. A regular network is one that is highly ordered. See the circle furthest to the left in this diagram. For a regular network. In a regular network, each node is connected to the same number of its nearest neighbors. The nodes of the regular network in the example are each connected to their 4 nearest neighbors. In a random network, the circular diagram on the right, each node may still have the same number of connections, but the connections are not necessarily to the node's nearest neighbors. Instead, the connections are random. Between these two extremes are networks with some nearest neighbors connections and some random connections. This area of research is called graph theory. The black dots in these examples represent nodes. We can think of these nodes as representing the agents in complex adaptive systems. Watson and Strogatz showed how replacing each connection in a regular network with a random connection with a probability of p results in the average distance between any two nodes dropping off rapidly. It is the path length L, represented by the lower curve in the graph. The path length L drops off quickly, being the average number of steps between any two nodes, while the clustering coefficient, represented as C in the upper line in the graph, the clustering coefficient is a measure of the interconnectedness of nearest neighbors. When all nearest neighbors are connected, as in a regular network, the clustering coefficient is close to 1. The clustering coefficient drops off to near 0 for random networks. As can be seen in this figure, even a small change from a highly structured regular network results in a much shorter average path length, even as the clustering coefficient stays high. As Watson and Strogatz put it, each shortcut has a highly nonlinear effect on L, contracting the distance, not just between the nodes that it connects, but between their immediate neighborhoods, neighborhoods of neighborhoods, and so on. From a practical standpoint, this means that while we might have a relatively small group of highly interconnected friends and acquaintances in our geographic area, we only need to know someone who knows someone in another geographic area to result in a relatively short path length to anyone else in the world. In their 1998 letter to the publication Nature, Watson and Strogatz predicted that SmallWorld Networks would prove to be widespread in biological, social, and man-made systems, often with important dynamical consequences. This statement has been shown to be correct, if somewhat understated. The small world phenomena has been identified in social networks of all kinds, including friendship networks, email communication networks, online social networks. It's also been identified in the internet itself, web links, loans among financial institutions, and manufacturing supply networks. Depending on what it is that's being studied, geographic distance can be replaced with other factors that separate us from other social groups. For example, if you belong to 2 different online groups, you could be the shortcut between those 2 groups. Watson and Strogatz showed how clustering and average length changes as a network goes from completely structured to random. The feature of average path length and high clustering has some very interesting ties to complex adaptive systems. For instance, notice that the optimal small world configuration occurs between complete order and complete chaos, as discussed in the previous section. The small world network topology also seems to be an optimal configuration to support the exploration exploitation dynamic, an order chaos dynamic that is common in complex adaptive systems. The exploration exploitation dynamic occurs in systems as diverse as ant colonies foraging for food, and us humans when we're searching our brains for information. In fact, we could look at all of the continuums discussed in the previous section in terms of an exploitation-exploration dynamic. So it should not be surprising that our brains are thought to have a small world network configuration. The small world network configuration also plays a role in the diffusion of innovation. But before leaving this slide, let me emphasize one thing. It should be noted that the system breaks down at the extremes. Recall that when talking about the order-chaos dynamic, I pointed out that living systems do not exist at extremes of complete order or complete chaos. What's known about small world networks illustrates one reason why this might be the case. When the system is too ordered, average path lengths are too long. When the system is too random, the clustering coefficient is too low. Both extremes result in an inefficient network with agents that are not well connected to the rest of the network. How does all of this relate to creativity? Well, many creativity theorists argue that to be creative, something has to be novel and of value. The value of a creative idea or an innovation is linked to how many people adopt the idea or innovation. From this perspective, how creative something is directly linked to its diffusion throughout a population. Therefore, understanding the diffusion process helps us understand something about creativity. For decades, the rate of adoption of an innovation has been thought to start out slowly and steadily increase until the rate reaches an inflection point and begins to decrease, eventually forming the widely recognized bell curve. That is, when the number of people adopting an innovation is plotted over time, the curve is bell-shaped, as illustrated by the blue line in the figure. This frequency distribution is variously known as a normal distribution or a Gaussian distribution. If instead of plotting the number of new adopters for each unit of time, the cumulative number of adopters is plotted, the result is the S-curve, illustrated by the green line in the figure. The diffusion of innovations is generally viewed as a social process influenced by social networks, and social networks have been shown to exhibit small world network properties. So small world networks have several parameters that affect the diffusion of information and the adoption rate of an innovation, such as the clustering coefficient and the average path length that was just discussed. If the adoption of each individual innovation propagates through its own unique small world network, each with its own unique set of parameters, can we expect any characteristic adoption frequency distribution? And if not, what are the implications for innovators trying to get their creative product widely adopted? If social networks were static and all agents were identical, we could make predictions about how an individual innovation would diffuse through a population. But social networks are complex adaptive systems, so they're never static. People are complex adaptive systems, so they're constantly varying along many dimensions that affect the acceptance or rejection of a new idea or product. So there are the various personality factors that may affect whether, in the words of Everett Rogers, who studied innovation or diffusion of innovations, someone is an innovator, an early adopter, part of the early majority, late majority, or a laggard. As discussed in the earlier section on the order-chaos dynamic, these personality factors should not be considered static. Also, each innovation is unique. Each has a set of characteristics that affects its likelihood to diffuse. Rogers identifies these characteristics as relative advantage, compatibility, complexity, triability, and observability. On top of all of this, there are different market types, different go-to-market strategies, differing requirements for supporting infrastructure, network effects, inertia, sunk costs, stickiness of processes, and risks. All of this conspires to make the diffusion profile of any individual innovation unknowable, not the classic normal distribution and its associated S-curve that has been part of diffusion of innovation studies for the last 50 years. When it comes to the diffusion of innovations, complex adaptive systems theory predicts the unpredictability of the diffusion of any individual innovation. But it also predicts that patterns will emerge in aggregated data. And that's exactly what I found when I reviewed several sets of data for different innovations. Coming up are the cumulative distribution curves of the same data sets. In some cases, there's a hint of an S-curve, but others look more like power law distributions, which are characterized by a rapid rise and then a tapering off. And just going to try and shut off an application here so it's not beeping all the time. A statistical analysis of these data sets found that it's unlikely any of these came from a population with a normal distribution, or for that matter, a population with any common distribution type. And as mentioned, complexity theory predicts unpredictability of individual instances. It predicts that patterns will appear in aggregated data. In diffusion of innovations data, this pattern is generally the power law distribution that frequently appears, such as in this one, which is the box office receipts for the top 5,000 movies. This shows that there are a large number of movies that don't bring in much money at all, and a smaller and smaller number of movies that have larger box office receipts. These power law distributions are also seen in the financial results of crowdfunding campaigns, number of scientific papers published by an individual researchers, number of citations of a paper, number of songs published by an artist, and the number of listens to a song. The implications for creators and innovators are that if you want a successful innovation, have lots of innovations. And you should manage portfolios of innovations and creative works rather than individual efforts. And start with a lean approach and nurture innovations that are getting traction. Also market to a close-knit cluster until adoption within the cluster is self-propagating. That is, it's reached a tipping point. Then find the strongest linkages between the initial clusters and other clusters. Now it's time to move on to the third characteristic of complex adaptive systems that I'll be discussing, emergence and creativity. But we'll have to start with more definitions. Emergence is the arising of a new entity resulting from the interaction of a set of diverse, independent yet interdependent agents that adapt to each other and their environment. The new entity is one that could not have been predicted from a complete knowledge of the agents and their relationships. Examples include human societies, life, consciousness, cities, the stock market, and the intelligent behavior of ant colonies. Emergence can also take place over multiple levels. For example, macromolecules such as proteins emerge from the interaction of molecules. Macromolecules form cells, cells form tissue, tissues form organs and organ systems, organs form organisms, organisms form populations, populations form communities, social systems and ecosystems form biospheres. In these systems, the individual agents influence the higher level emergent, and the emergent influences the agents. For example, individuals influence society, while society has an influence on individuals. And our mind or consciousness can have an effect on our brain, our synapses, while our synapses have an effect on our consciousness. This is known as the micro-macro influence. Now I'll have to get into a bit of a philosophical argument or discussion about the definition of creativity in order to make the connection between emergence and creativity. Creativity is often defined as something that is novel and of value. In place of the criteria novel, some creativity researchers propose using one of the synonyms new, unique, or original. In place of the criteria of value, some researchers argue for appropriate, adaptive, relevant, compelling, useful, effective, acceptable, or realistic. There have been dozens, if not hundreds, of different definitions proposed. Context has been raised as an issue, as has intentionality. Some think surprising must be part of the definition, while others argue that usefulness is not a necessary criteria. For example, Smith and Smith think something only needs the potential to be useful in order to be considered creative. These and many other issues related to a definition can be resolved with a complexity theory-based definition of creativity. I've compared the theories and definitions of creativity with theories and definitions of complex adaptive systems to develop just such a new definition of creativity. It's a definition of creativity based on the ontological emergence of creativity. Creativity is the result of two or more entities being brought together, resulting in a new and unexpected entity that is both fundamental and dependent. That is, a complete understanding of the initial entities does not result in an understanding of the new entity, and the new entity cannot exist without the existence of the initial entities. Now, this is another challenging definition to take in all at once. So I'll unpack this definition in more manageable chunks to make it a little easier to understand. You may notice that this is a very similar definition to that for emergence discussed earlier. I've found the construct of creativity aligns so well with the construct of emergence that it's possible to think of them as one and the same. Of course, emergence also suffers from having many different definitions. Here I've relied on a definition based on ontological emergence, which I'll discuss after some basic definitions. Ontology is the study of questions of what is real, what exists, is there an objective reality? An entity is defined here as something that has its own existence, separate from, but not necessarily independent of, the elements that make it up, or from which it arose. And complete knowledge, in this case, refers to what has become known as Laplace's demon. In 1814, Pierre-Simon Laplace published a thought experiment in which he argued that if a superintelligence were to know the positions, velocities of, and forces acting upon every particle in the universe, the superintelligence would know everything about the universe, past, present, and future. As an interesting side note, this concept brings into question our own agency. Do we have free will, or are we just carrying out a script that has been predetermined by our genes and our environment? I think complexity theory contains the answer, or at least hints at it. And I've already defined the term emergence, but to fully understand ontological emergence of creativity, we'll have to go a little further on the next slide. What we need is a more concrete understanding of emergence. Elizabeth Barnes presents a theory of emergence that places limits on what should be considered emergent and how emergent entities can be understood in relation to other entities. And she does this by appealing to fundamentalist ontology and ontological dependence. That is, ontological emergence. The fundamentalist sees the world as existing in hierarchical levels. The lowest level, the level at which entities cannot be further broken down into constituent parts, is fundamental. Barnes argues that fundamentality does not come in degrees. An entity is either fundamental or it's not, while everything that is not fundamental is derived from fundamental entities. She further points out that the fundamentalist view does not have to be a physicalist view. That is, entities can be physical or non-physical. Barnes's theory of ontological emergence also draws on the concept of ontological dependence, which she defines ontological dependence as occurring in situations where the existence of an entity is dependent on other things existing along with it. You cannot ever have the entity by itself. Combining fundamentality, dependence, and their counterparts yields a 2x2 matrix as shown in this table. The argument is that an entity can be fundamental, that is, it cannot be broken down into or explained by more fundamental entities, or it can be derived, that is, made up of more fundamental entities. And an entity can be either dependent or independent. That is, its existence either depends on other elements or it does not. And as you can see by the table, an emergent entity is one which is fundamental, can't be explained by lower level entities, and it's dependent. It will cease to exist if the lower level entities that gave rise to it cease to exist. Two examples might help. Consider, for example, consciousness in societies. Human societies arise as a result of the interactions of human beings. In this ontological emergence argument, human beings are the diverse, independent yet interdependent agents that are adapting to the changes of other agents and their environment. If all humans suddenly ceased to exist, human societies would cease to exist. However, if we had complete knowledge of every human being, we would still never be able to predict that human societies would arise as a result of their interactions without some prior knowledge of human societies specifically or societies in general. For the example of consciousness, many people consider consciousness to be an emergent that arises as the result of the interaction of many synapses. Based on the argument of ontological emergence, the synapses, in this case, are the diverse, independent yet interdependent agents that are adapting to the changes of other agents in their environment, for example, neurotransmitters. Without the existence of the synapses, consciousness cannot exist. However, consciousness cannot be explained or predicted, even with a complete understanding of the agents giving rise to it. So what is required to be able to change the current conceptualization of creativity to one where it is the same construct as emergence? Largely, it's just agreeing with Smith and Smith's view that something does not have to have value to be creative. It only has to have the potential to have value to be creative. Another way of looking at it is that there is inherent value in the adaptive or evolutionary process. Therefore, there is value in the creative process, even when a creative idea ends up having little to no value of its own. However, the creative idea also has to be dependent and fundamental. That is, two or more entities or ideas, in this case, must be brought together to form something new that is not immediately obvious from knowledge of the entities on their own. This definition of creativity opens up a new way of understanding creativity and new avenues of research. the short form definition of creativity based on ontological emergence is that it's the ontological emergence of an idea. The longer form being that it is the result of two or more entities being brought together, resulting in a new and unexpected entity that is both fundamental and dependent. That is, a complete understanding of the initial entities does not result in an understanding of the new entity, and the new entity cannot exist without the initial entities. And there you have it, a brief overview of the argument for the equivalence of emergence and creativity. And since life and consciousness are emergent entities, this argues for the inseparability of creativity, life, and consciousness. Sorry, just having some trouble getting slides advancing here. This leads to a lot of so what about this research. At a very high level, I'd say that it's about the fact that all creativity arises from complex adaptive systems. And all complex adaptive systems exhibit creativity. Life is a complex adaptive system, so there is no life without creativity. Now there are more less philosophical and more practical applications of this theory of creativity, including if you want to have a great idea, have lots of ideas. This is a new and unique complex adaptive systems model that I've developed by integrating it with creativity, and it really gets at how does nature work. It brings up a new and unique model of creativity. At the same time, it provides a theoretical underpinning for the need to diversify investments and why it's wise to do lean startups, why diversity on teams works, but it also shows that you can have too much diversity. It shows that being dynamic along continuums leads to adaptability and thereby to survivability. It suggests that we should manage portfolios rather than individual instances of creativity, and that we should seek variety. And knowing that individual results are unpredictable, but patterns are expected, can be help in us managing creative efforts. It can help us to understand and address questions like the internet and social media. Is it helping or hurting creativity? Why? Many people struggle to understand complex adaptive systems theory. I found it very challenging at first myself. I read about 20 books and many papers on the subject. Most were written from a very discipline-specific perspective. So they used different terminology and focused on different characteristics. I think I was able to bring a post-disciplinary perspective to this work and thereby develop a simpler, easier to understand model. Disciplines are a result of reductionism. And complexity theory shows that while we still study parts, we need to also consider the whole and the interrelationships. And I've found that anything related to complex adaptive systems is best researched from an interdisciplinary or post-disciplinary way. And I have, I think, another slide or two on future research, but I will leave it at that so that we have a little bit of time for questions if there are any. I know that's a fair bit of dry material to run through quickly, but